Hello, my name is Irina Raicu, and I'm the Internet Ethics Program Manager at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics. On January 23rd, Santa Clara University hosted a panel discussion on privacy by design and engineering ethics. The participants were Mozilla's Director of Identity, Ben Adida, the co-founder of Disconnect, Brian Kennish, and Princeton University Assistant Professor Arvind Narayanan. To begin with, we asked them to offer their definitions of privacy by design.
Let me share my perspective, and I think a good way to do that is by sort of contrasting that by the typical design process at many Silicon Valley companies, and by contrasting privacy by design with what typically goes on. So normally in product development, it's almost a matter of ethos not to worry about things like privacy when you're initially developing the product. You don't want to inhibit that hacker creativity, so you just let engineers run loose and build whatever product they want to do. But then before you release it, there are a variety of due diligence things you need to do, and privacy is one of them. Often it's driven by lawyers or by compliance needs and so on. And so what happens during this process is that privacy is something that's thought of as some magic pixie dust that you sprinkle on top so that this beautiful product that you've built now becomes safe to release so that you can avoid people getting too upset about it. And so privacy gets turned into a bunch of legalese and some terms of service documents somewhere, or at best, from a technology perspective, it gets turned into a set of access control policies on top of your product, which ends up not being very useful to people. Right? And if you look at sort of the chatter among engineers in Silicon Valley, you might hear from people at Google, for example, "Oh my God, our product has been stuck in privacy review for like 3 weeks. These privacy people are really making it hard to develop any products." So that's kind of, to me, the antithesis of privacy by design. That's sort of how not to do it, both from the point of view of making it better for consumers and for the company themselves, and avoid this whole two-stage process. So it's both a process and an outcome. What the process involves for me is the engineers being really educated about privacy from the get-go, and the very design of the product incorporating a notion of what it means for that product ultimately to have privacy. And so since I picked on Google a little bit, let me give a couple of examples where Google really got it right. Let's look at what I mean by the outcome incorporating privacy by design. If you look at Google+, for example, the idea of circles, as you're probably familiar with, is a very central design feature, right? Now, is that a privacy feature or is that just a feature? It's neither, it's both. There's really no distinction. And that's what I mean by getting privacy by design right. It's such an integral part of your product design, right, that it's not something you build on top just in order to answer people's privacy concerns, but it's an inherent part of the design of your product. In other cases, you might need to, in the design stage, you might have to decide that certain features that you really want to build are simply infeasible from the privacy point of view. There's really no way to build them in a way that respects people's privacy, and you might be forced to cut back on that. And that's, being open to that, I think, is another aspect of what it means for me to have privacy by design. Let me give you one example of that. LiveJournal, back in the day, I'm probably also dating myself because nobody uses it really anymore, except probably in Russia.
Weren't you 12 when LiveJournal was around?
No, not quite. So LiveJournal is an example of a product and that in many ways really got privacy right. People felt comfortable enough sharing very, very sensitive information on there, the type which we don't really see on Facebook or any other product today. And one of the many things that they did that enabled this was that they had poor SEO. SEO stands for search engine optimization. It's a technical term that means that LiveJournal posts are hard to find through Google searches. Now, if you propose this to an engineer, they'll think you're insane. This is typically not something you do ever in designing your product. You always design your product to maximize how easy it is to be found through Google searches. But if people have privacy concerns, you give them access control options so that they can hide their posts only to their friends instead of being visible to the world, etc. But LiveJournal, whether accidentally or by design, managed to integrate this idea of not making posts easily searchable into their product. And what this meant is that in a practical sense, posts that people shared on LiveJournal were much more obscure than we're typically used to seeing on other platforms. Accidental disclosures of somebody finding something sensitive and then resharing it with the world were much less likely to happen. So what this meant is that this is what enabled sort of the norm of much more sharing of sensitive information on LiveJournal, and it was a success from that perspective. So to recap what I said, it's both a process and an outcome. I think engineers should be aware of privacy principles from the get-go, and it should shape the design of the product. You should be willing to compromise on having some features if you feel that it's inherently at odds with privacy. And also there are a bunch of features that are neither privacy features nor inherent features. They're kind of both. And it's when you hit those features, like Google Plus Circles, that it really feels that privacy has been well integrated, smoothly integrated into the design of the product.
Brian, did you have a different take on what privacy by design means?
Yeah, so for me, I think I have what I would say a weak definition and a strong definition of privacy by design. I think what Arvind just articulated is much more along the lines of what I would term the weak definition, which is that, and as I think the more standard definition, which is that you are thinking about privacy as you're building your product. For me, I first learned about this concept of privacy by design from one of the engineers on the Tor project, which is a peer-to-peer way of anonymizing your web browsing. And I term this more the strong definition of privacy by design, which is that you don't have to trust the developer of an application or service. You only have to trust the application or service itself. And there are two properties that make that possible. One is that the code of the application or service is open source, so any privacy or security researcher can go through the code and see what it actually does. And the second property is that you have to have a way to verify that code that you're looking at is actually what's running on your computer or running on the provider's service. So to me, that's the stronger definition of privacy by design, where, again, if I'm the developer of a product, you don't have to trust me. You just can see in the product or service itself that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing privacy and security-wise.
And Ben, can we confirm that 3 different people would have at least 4 different definitions, or do you just agree with what you've heard so far?
I agree that those are definitely good definitions. But hey, since we want to spice things up a little bit, let me first give you one thought, and then I'm going to disagree with Brian on one point. Everything's about incentives. Developers of products in Silicon Valley and everywhere else, their incentive is to build a great product that gets users, that makes them successful. And oftentimes, that goes hand in hand with gathering a lot of data that helps them build those great products. So I think when you think about what gets us to the point that we are now, where lots of folks are worried about privacy, it's not that anybody sat down and said, I don't care about privacy, or let's violate everybody's privacy. They had an incentive to build great products, and it turns out that given the architecture of the web today, getting a lot of data from users is what tends to help companies build great products. Whether it's Google's extensive use of A/B testing and collecting of data to figure out what users are really going to need, or whether it's companies collecting a lot more data because they think they can introduce features later that use that data, and they don't want to preclude the introduction of those features later. So we've got a set of incentives today that set us up for companies wanting to collect more data for, in the end, good reasons, mostly. They want to build good products. And we have to figure out a way to, privacy by design should be a way to try to mitigate that a little bit and counteract it with other incentives. Figure out how we architect the web in general to enable better privacy outcomes by aligning some of those incentives. For one thing that Brian said I want to disagree with a little bit, it's the strong definition of privacy by design, where it works for things like Firefox, right? That built by Mozilla, by folks like Sid over here and at my company. The code is open source. Everybody can check it. You know what you're getting when you download Firefox, and it's fantastic. For things like web browsers, you can do that kind of strong definition. But for a lot of websites, you can't. You cannot know for sure what code is running in your browser when you load Facebook.com or Google.com at that moment. In fact, for every user, the code is probably different. So a lot of the things that make the web amazing are sometimes difficult to reconcile with privacy. And that's not an opinion, it's just, it's a fact, right? In my opinion, it's a fact. So we have to deal with that. We have to deal with that conflict and say, if we had the strong definition of privacy by design, we would not have the amazing web we have today. So what are we willing to give up? What are we willing to, how can we find creative ways to get win-wins? I don't know that I have all the answers there, but we have to realize that there's an inherent conflict. And I'm not sure that strong definition of privacy by design can be applied for everything. I think there's very limited use cases.
I hate to jump on the disagreeing with Brian bandwagon, but I kind of have to just a little bit again. And I like that you delineated the weak definition and strong definition, and I think it is important to keep both in mind. I want to say, Ben's point was that the strong definition a lot of the time may be infeasible to achieve. And I want to say that a lot of the time it's also not really necessary. I think there's a reason that the place you got the strong definition from is from Tor, which is a product that's typically used for people who actually have an adversary going after them, who are in that model where it's really a cat and mouse game. There are high stakes. There might be an oppressive government hunting you down or something like that. So in that case, it's really important to minimize the trust in any entity outside of your own device, outside of your own computer, so that you can have that sense of self-reliance. But in a lot of cases, if you're the user of a social network or something like that, I'm not sure if that level of almost paranoia, which makes sense in the Tor case, right? But I'm not sure if that level of strong privacy protection is necessary. And I think incorporating trust in the service provider or the developer of a product can let us go much farther than saying, I'm only going to trust code that I've reviewed myself that runs on my computer. So I just wanted to make that distinction.
So I don't mean to call out this example as the sort of the ideal of privacy by design, but since this has been in the news this week, I think it's good to bring up. So you probably heard that Mega launched this week, and I would say they're pitching themselves a lot around the stronger concept of privacy by design, and you can sort of verify what they're doing in the code they deliver to your browser. And again, I don't want to argue whether it's marketing hype or whether it's legitimate privacy and security stuff, but I think a lot of what they're attempting to do makes sense in terms of what's technically feasible and allows a lot of the sort of services that already exist to be implemented in a more privacy and security friendly sort of way.
Good point.
And maybe to your point, Arvind, maybe privacy by design means different things for different types of products.
Yes, excellent. Yeah, that's an excellent way to put it. Yeah.
Can I jump in and add a little thing? I'm going to disagree a little bit with Arvind. Just not what you said now, but what you said earlier. I think so how do you structure a company, a product team, to do privacy by design? And Arvind was suggesting that every engineer should have some basic training and understand how that works, how privacy works. I don't think that works. One, it doesn't scale. You can't actually train every engineer to understand privacy. And two, what you risk is creating products that will, depending on where you lean, either you only think about privacy a little bit, in which case it doesn't matter that much, or you think about it a lot, and then privacy becomes your driving factor, and you build a product that nobody uses, and so it doesn't matter, right? And this is something that we argue a lot about at Mozilla, because Mozilla is a company that's made up of probably the most privacy, the biggest privacy enthusiasts I've ever met. I thought I was a privacy enthusiast until I joined Mozilla. It turns out when you talk to users, when you talk to folks who think about user experience in products, privacy and security, they're not even in the top 3 things that users consider when they initially decide to use a product or not. It's like It's like car insurance or life insurance. Things you would never do unless the law requires you to, right? How many people want to think about car crashes when they get a car, right? So we've done user research for the product that we're working on, Mozilla Persona, which is a login solution that is privacy protecting. We've done user research to figure out how we should present it to users. And we got some really fascinating information back, which is, it's not that saying a product is privacy protecting it's not that people don't care, it's actually that it hurts you. It hurts you because you're bringing up a topic that makes people uncomfortable. It's like, think about a bank ad that tells you, we've got a really strong vault. Why are you telling me that? Why are you telling me about how thick the door to your vault is? Should I be worried about my money not being safe, right? So you're bringing a topic to the table that makes people uncomfortable, and just the fact that you brought it up is going to drive users away. So what we've had to do with our product is, if you dig in the documentation, you'll find out about how privacy protecting we are. But that's not how we pitch it. We just don't talk about it that way. So to get back to how you put the team together to build a privacy protecting product, I think what you have to have is strong product advocates who don't care at all about privacy, and strong privacy advocates who really couldn't care less about product. And you have to have those folks fight it out. Because if you don't have the strong product view, if you don't get that driver in there, then you will have no impact. And if you have no impact, then you might as well not build that software.
I'm curious about something you said, which was that you don't think engineers can be educated about privacy.
I think it's not scalable to educate all engineers about privacy.
To what degree?
So, Ben, I don't want to necessarily disagree with that, but I just want to throw in one data point. When Microsoft decided about a decade ago that the constant security breaches in Windows were really hurting them, they launched a drive, which is precisely the analog of this, which is to educate every engineer about security. And, they were able to make that scale, and at least the thinking within the company, and I think by a lot of external observers, is that it is precisely that drive for internal developer education that led to a tremendous increase in the average security level of Microsoft products over the following 5 years, in which still continues today. So certainly it has a cost. It's not for free. Everything that a developer spends time doing is something that they could have been building products instead. But I don't necessarily know that it's completely infeasible to have that as a goal.
That's a fair point.
So in terms of what the FTC and the White House and AG's office now are requiring, they are demanding that developers think about privacy, whether it's doable or not. That's what the demand is. And I'm wondering whether you think that at this point, developers and software engineers are thinking about privacy, or whether that would require a shift in their thinking. And so far, I'm kind of hearing that no, they're not, that it will require a shift in their thinking. Is that?
I'm going to go back to the incentives point. And Sid and I, if you want to know about Firefox privacy, by the way, Sid over here can tell you a whole bunch of stuff. I tend to do services. He does browser stuff. We were talking about this, and he mentioned a really interesting point. Data has primary and secondary uses. Primary uses for data is to fulfill the feature that you, the user, want, right? So you would like to tell your friends on Facebook that you are in a relationship. So you give that data to Facebook, and they put it on your page. That's a primary use. You know what data you're giving to Facebook. They are putting it on your page. They have that data for the purpose of fulfilling a feature that you seek. A secondary use is using that data to help advertisers target you. That is not something that you probably care about. Right? And as I was thinking more deeply about this point that Sid was making, that you have to draw the line between primary and secondary uses of data, and that is usually where people start to get frustrated about privacy. You have to understand that we have a web where almost everything is free. I don't know if that was by accident. We can argue whether it was by accident or whether it was the natural evolution of things, or that. But the point is, we tend to shy away from websites that ask you to pay. What that means is that we are setting up an incentive for those websites to collect data and provide you a service that's meant for primary uses, but then they have to survive And so they look for secondary uses of that data that will help them survive. And I think those two things are closely intertwined. The fact that we have a web that is free, and thus that we create an enormous incentive for secondary uses of that data. So train developers all you want. I think that's important, right? The incentives are going to trump all. If the incentives, the financial incentives are, well, I'm not going to get money from the user, I'm going to get money from advertisers, or I'm going to get money from other sources, there's going to be secondary uses of the data, and that's what's creating the problem.
Do you think that the incentives are changing because of the growing debates around privacy and the growing awareness and the growing concern that, fueled by all the media reports? Brian?
Well, I brought up the example of Mega. I would also say probably the hottest startup in Silicon Valley right now is Snapchat, which is a company that, if not pitches privacy, certainly has privacy as a core feature of what they do. So, I think the perception among users has changed quite a bit, and it's definitely something that users are quite a bit more interested in. I think, Ben just got to the sort of fundamental point behind all of this stuff, though, which is that the economic model is kind of broken on the web. And it's kind of the underpinnings of all of the kind of bad stuff that goes on in the privacy space. So, that's something that I've been thinking about for a long time, and I really don't know what the solution is. But it's certainly something that we have to think a lot about as the root cause.
I think part of the solution is the stuff that you're doing, Brian. And when you create additional forces in the market, like your work with Disconnect and some of the work we're doing at Mozilla with the privacy features that we build in, when you create company product level counterforces, you begin to get to a better place. And I think that without that, if it's just users asking, which is important, by the way, things like the do not track effort and such, I think those are really important. But I don't think they're enough. I think you've got to have counter forces, which also means that you've got to have users that are willing to pay for those things, right? So I think as a user, if you're concerned, that's one thing you should do. Pay for tools that help you improve your privacy as much as you can.
Getting to your question, Irina, of whether it's media or what are the forces that are leading to user awareness, increasing demand for privacy, I want to call out some examples in particular of how much influence the media has had. The Wall Street Journal What They Know series alone, almost by itself, sort of kickstarted the interest in the last 2 years from the public, from regulators, which then turned into interest from the W3C. It's the whole reason we're talking about Do Not Track today that Ben just brought up. So the actions of that one individual, Julie Engwin, and the others who worked with her at the Wall Street Journal sort of had this snowball effect that have led to a dramatic increase in awareness and some change as well. I think academics can play a role. When I see in my own community as an academic, whenever a study comes out that exposes privacy and security vulnerabilities, that leads to further media attention and a further round of increase in awareness, creating proof of concepts for people to understand what's going on the web, how their data is being used. The EFF's Panopticlick project. Have you guys seen this? It's called browser fingerprinting. You should look it up if you have a chance. If you haven't seen it, it's called Panopticlick. Google it. What it does is you go to a web page, and it's able to show so it turns out that your web browser barfs up a whole lot of information to the website every time you visit a web page. This includes things like your entire list of installed fonts. It includes things like a user agent string that's a description of your browser down to certain minutiae. And if you put all these things together, it's such an accurate profile of your browser that with a very high probability, your browser, your device, is unique among all the browsers, all the devices in the whole world. Right? So computer scientists knew this all the time. This was nothing new to us, but the general public didn't know. And my description of it, you're kind of trying to imagine it, but it's not a very good description. You have to really look at it to see it. And that's why the ZFF project called Panopticlick really changed the game. They put it out there. People were so surprised that it just spread by word of mouth. Within a week or two, they had 2 million hits. And then the media started writing about it. And then there was a lot of pressure on companies who are using these techniques like device fingerprinting to identify individual users to change their practices, and that's led to a lot of change. So I think all of these forces can counteract the natural incentive of companies to collect more and more data and to monetize it. And I think increased transparency is one good way that outsiders can make a change.
And just to throw it out there, EFF is the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Those don't know the acronym.
Thanks.
So
I do think, Arvind, though, that overstates the case a little bit. I mean, so there are companies that are built strictly around doing analytics tracking through browser fingerprinting, and they're thriving as far as I understand today. Probably all of us, you know, in the course of our browsing in the last week hit one of these companies. So I do think obviously efforts like that are super duper important, but you know, I think, for example, cookies are finally on in everyone's vocabulary today, but you know, that took 10 or 15 years. I don't think browser fingerprinting is going to hit mainstream consciousness for years and years to come. And you know, in the meantime, all of us are being, you know, browser fingerprinted.
So that's true. I wouldn't say that our points of view are necessarily in conflict, because let's look at it from the perspective of some numbers. It's true that the browser fingerprinting companies are surviving and thriving. My point wasn't necessarily that the backlash is so severe that they're going to shut down. Instead, if you look at the usage of privacy features, right, Do Not Track is well into the double digits. The usage of plugins like Ghosttree, etc., huge uptake. And if I might say so, the reason that your company is thriving is also because there's a greatly increased awareness of privacy among users. So I think there's a certain amount of balance. There are people who are, just like people who are early adopters of tech products, there are people who are more concerned about privacy and less concerned about privacy. And if we can do things that raise awareness among people who are on the privacy forefront, and if we have tools for them to protect themselves, I think we've still done a good job. It's not necessary that browser fingerprinting companies have to shut down and there's no tracking going on in order to claim that we've improved the privacy landscape.
Yeah, my point is certainly not that they should shut down. To your point, I mean, I think it should be something that we know about. Mm-hmm. That's only my point, right? So, I imagine a lot of people would not have a problem with what browser fingerprinting companies are doing, but it should be something that's more, ideally it would be in more people's minds.
Ben, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say that Arvind's example is great because it highlights the inherent difficulty, right? So the Panopticlick project, which basically, a website code can ask for things like what are the plugins that are installed, what are the fonts installed, etc. So you might think, oh, well, let's just shut that down, right? Let's get to it and shut it down. Well, we have really smart folks like Sid who are working on doing just that in Firefox, and it's really hard. The reason it's really hard is because websites depend on this ability to detect how your browser is configured to do different things. And sometimes it's not just about asking the question, they can detect through side effects. And one really interesting issue that came up a few years ago, if you visit a link, it turns purple, right, as opposed to blue if you've clicked on it. So if a web page renders in your browser links to the top 1,000 websites, some of them will be purple, some of them will be blue, right, depending on where you visited. Well, it turns out a few years ago that the website could render all of these links in a way that was hidden, so you're just playing your game here, your little flash game, and meanwhile all these links are being rendered in a hidden frame, and then the website can simply interrogate, is this link blue? Is this thing purple? Is this thing blue? Is this thing purple? And at the time it was, and basically figure out which sites you visited, effectively sniff the history of your web browser. And because it was able to do that very quickly, it could do hundreds of thousands of link checks in a matter of seconds, right? It could profile you in a way that you wouldn't believe, and then it could use that to do security attacks like phishing attacks. Oh, you are at Bank of America. Well, let me show you a Bank of America login screen, right? Incredibly powerful. And it was not clear how to fix that for a while. Should you just turn off that feature and not have the links become purple when you've clicked on them? That was a proposed solution. In fact, one of my proposed solutions to this was to be much stricter about when a link would go purple. and make it such that it really wouldn't yield as much information. But it also reduced the value to you, the user, right? It's kind of nice when you go on Reddit and you know which links you've already visited, right? You kind of want to know that. So it turns out that David Barron at Mozilla figured out a really smart solution, this kind of way to just win-win, keep the feature and significantly slow down the ability of websites to do this. But it required a lot of thinking and a lot of time to implement it, and then eventually other browsers implemented it too. And I don't think we're going to find solutions to all of these problems. I think some of these are just unsolvable.
But we were just saying before that there are trade-offs between various functions and things that are useful and privacy. And I'm wondering, I mean, I keep hearing that engineers are problem solvers.
Yeah.
So if we add this, variable to the problem and we say we want all of this and privacy, well, we just challenge the engineers to find a solution. And I understand that it can be hard and take a long time and take a lot of resources, but is it just impossible, or is it that we haven't weighed privacy enough as something that we want?
You mean we as a society?
Yes.
We as a society don't value privacy as in the moment as much as we do convenience. That's just the way it is, right? The average user cares about convenience first and foremost, and later, if their privacy is damaged, then they will care. So I think we absolutely should work to train developers to be more aware of this conflict. Right? With great power comes great responsibility. If you're a developer, you should be aware of the fact that users don't understand this, and where possible, you should make an effort to do that. But I'll go back to the incentives, right? At the end of the day, if you want a stable structure that promotes privacy in the long term, as opposed to, we've got a lot of awareness for the next 6 weeks, we get a few privacy wins, and then everybody forgets, and we go back to the status quo. If you want a long-term trend towards better privacy, got to set up the right incentives for that to be a stable setup. And that probably means some mix of light touch regulation. You want to be very careful with that because sometimes that hurts more than it helps. And finding ways to encourage efforts like disconnect, efforts like the privacy features that we're doing at Mozilla. So one of the things we're trying to do at Mozilla is make sure that the web platform, the web itself, is more amenable to these pro-privacy solutions, right? Like disconnect, making it possible in Firefox to implement solutions like disconnect, nudging the platform that is the web to enable these user choices towards better privacy. But it's a long-term game, and we've got to find that more stable equilibrium that keeps us in a more private state, not just it's good for a couple weeks and then we're back.
Let me get to the same point that Ben made, but in a different way. So the question was, can't you just define the technical problem that the engineers are supposed to solve to be whatever problem they were solving initially, plus throw in privacy as an additional constraint? Let me ask you, has anyone heard of Feltons Third Law? Who's heard of Feltons Third Law?
Is that like Newton's third?
Felton's Third Law was coined, I guess, in honor of Professor Ed Felton by Paul Ohm. It says that when a problem is too hard for either technologists or lawyers to solve, the lawyers will think it's a technology problem, and the technologists will think it's a legal problem. And if I may say so, I think that's kind of what's going on here. Like, when you look at it from afar, you might think, oh, let's just add one more constraint to the technological space of what you're trying to solve, and then the problem will automatically go away. As a technologist, let me tell you that I do not think that that's going to happen. This is not a purely technology problem. Technology alone will not solve it, which gets me to Ben's point. You have to have economics, regulation, law, and policy, all that working together to get to what you call the stable equilibrium. I like that term. That's really the only way to look at it.
And Brian, do you believe more in hard sort of technological solutions, or do you think those are limited to certain contexts and certain products?
Well, again, to Ben's point, I mean, it's all well and good to say we got to train engineers or throw privacy and security engineers at a problem, but what is ultimately paying for that training or those engineers? So, I mean, ultimately, it has to come down to whether or not mainstream users really want these privacy and security features, whether or not it makes sense for Mozilla to invest all that they're investing in creating better privacy and security solutions. I mean, ultimately that comes down to users, and will users pick Firefox over another browser because Firefox has better privacy and security. One more thing that I just want to quickly touch on that Ben mentioned. The web is the most open platform that we have, and so building better privacy and security into the web is a lot more feasible than it is in building better privacy and security into iOS or Android, which are obviously becoming increasingly more important platforms. So the web is this sort of historical outlier in terms of how open it is to developers and for people like me that are interested in privacy and security for building solutions, but it's much more difficult to do those sorts of things on these closed systems. And I think it's also important for mainstream users, if privacy and security is really something that's important, to demand, to be able to have a more open platforms in other areas besides the web.
So I want to go back for a second to the point that people don't care about privacy, because that was preceded by the point that they don't understand what's going on, that it takes something like, with the Wall Street Journal explaining it, or some scandal. It's usually, one researcher putting something on his blog, and then all the tech media covers it, and finally it sort of trickles down to the rest of us who are non-techies. Do you think that it's the engineer's ethical responsibility or professional responsibility to educate the rest of us about all the implications of this technology? Because it's hard to expect people to demand something when they don't realize that really what's happening with their data, or much of anything on the web, even as we're using all these technologies all the time.
Yes, I personally believe that engineers have an ethical responsibility to think about the worlds they're creating. If you think back to, I came into the world of tech policy through Larry Lessig's writings and teachings, and generally the idea that the code we write creates these worlds and these rules about how the world works, and we have as responsibility, folks who build these worlds, to be transparent to users about how they work, and we have an ethical responsibility to do that. So on the one hand, I strongly believe that. On the other, I try to be a pragmatist and say, well, all it really takes is one strong economic incentive and a few people who don't really feel strongly about ethics for all that goodwill, all that good effort to be for naught, right? So I want to work on both fronts, right? I think to Arvind's very first point, where he was talking about privacy at some point, privacy for the most part is a compliance thing. One thing we can start to do to solve part of the problem is to do more privacy engineering. So at Mozilla we have privacy engineers, and they're not necessarily the same folks doing security engineering. There's folks who do both, right? It's not exactly the same thing. So we are engineering code for privacy. That's important. The reason it's important is because, again, I don't think most companies are evil. I don't think most developers are evil. They're not trying to, screw over the user. That's not the point. So privacy engineers will think about, okay, well, we're trying to accomplish this product goal. How do we take precautions along the way so that, we're not leaking the user's location everywhere they browse on the web, because that's actually not a product goal, right? So that's one. Within the incentives we currently have, within the products that we are currently building, how do we limit the privacy risk? And that I think we can address through better training, privacy engineering, and so on. But that's only part of the problem. The rest goes back to incentives, I think.
Arvind, what do you think about the ethics question? Is it on you guys?
So let me approach it this way. I think the extent to which the speed of technological developments and the scale of the internet has sort of changed the equation for who has to have ethical responsibility, I don't think has been fully appreciated. Let me give an example that has nothing to do with privacy. At one point, Google introduced some sort of doodle game on their search page, and it ran for 24 hours. And the next day, they proudly presented statistics of how many millions of people had played it, and everybody had fun. It was all well and good. But I did a little piece of math. So many people had played it, and there were statistics on how long they'd played it for. I multiplied that out, and it came to about 8 lifetimes. Right. So some engineer in like their 20% time spent a weekend writing some feature and put it out on the Google webpage. And this led to 8 lifetimes of people's time spent playing a game. Right? I'm not necessarily saying that that's a bad thing, but who's even thinking about what are the implications of that? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is that a waste of time, or did people get something out of it? You know, do we have any sort of paradigm for calculating whether the satisfaction or the fulfillment that people got out of playing a game is worth the amount of time that they spent on it? I don't know. But what has changed here is that a single person now at tech companies can create a feature, right, in an afternoon that can have this dramatic impact on millions of people. And it's that notion of scale, right? Being able to reach 1 billion people at the same time that has now changed. And there is nothing, there's no process sitting between engineers using these products. We talked about a game, let's talk about something more serious. A similar thing happened with Facebook releasing features. So there was another example where Facebook released some sort of new feature, and over a period of just a couple of days, you see people, this was during the Arab Spring, people in very sensitive situations starting to rely on that feature, right, for keeping their identities or their affiliations secret, right? So what are the ethical implications for the engineer there? What if there was a bug? What if they decide, for whatever reason, that feature is not working out so well, and so they retract it, and all of these thousands of people who were really relying on it, right, for help from their governments, are now, don't have that feature anymore. Right? So 2 things have changed. One is there's no intermediate layer of management or review or whatever between engineers and users, and the other is the number of end users you can impact at once. So for both of these reasons, I think the equation has changed dramatically, and ethics, just like privacy, just like security, needs to be an inherent part of what engineers think about in their normal process of day-to-day development.
So where should we have these kind of conversations? I shouldn't say we, because I'm not an engineer or a developer, but where should engineers have more of these kinds? Should it be in engineering schools? Should it be in the boot camps when they first start working? Should it be at established companies that are now having to deal with this notion of privacy by design? What would be the best place or the most effective way to have that conversation more?
We could start a blog. No. I think there's definitely a place for this in schools, of course. It's an important topic for everybody to know, and to know through visceral examples, right? There are no design principles that are going to make privacy by design super easy, right? But if you see a lot of these examples, a lot of the examples that Arvind mentioned, I think they give you a gut feeling for what's important to design. Privacy engineering is still pretty new. Chief privacy officers tend to be legal compliance folks, right? So it's, we should emphasize that. We should emphasize that kind of discussion. And then we should, again, to get back to my theme, figure out how we architect the web, which is where most of this is happening, to enable users to make the choices they want to make, including using tools like Disconnect, using the browsers they choose, even on iOS, and generally just have a system that lets us move to a more stable privacy equilibrium. But training is just part of it.
So, as a university professor, let me just say a few words about, the perspective of how it fits or doesn't fit into education as part of the college curriculum. Computer science professors have always had this perspective that what we teach our undergrads in school should be something lofty. It's not the day-to-day minutiae of programming. It's those fundamental principles of computing that will stay relevant in 50 years. So we have the saying that computer science is as much about computers as astronomy is about telescopes. You'll hear that from a lot of computer scientists. I think it's a little bit overstated, but I think there's also some truth to it. And because of this philosophy, which I think is sound, it's not what you need to be doing when in the process of computer science education is not vocational training, but more fundamental skills. Because of that, because we don't believe in teaching these minutiae and programming skills, one of the things that's that also gets discarded is things like ethics, things like privacy by design, what it would mean in practice. We might teach some principles of access control and things like that, but not what it means in the real world. And I think that's a problem. When I've talked to students who have taken technology ethics courses, they've always reported that it's one of the most rewarding and one of the most useful courses that they've taken. And so I think this idea of teaching technology ethics is not at odds with training a computer scientist in school. And I think that's something valuable that could be changed.